All right, welcome everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Normally, we get to gather together in our big renovated house adjacent to the campus of Agnes Scott College, and we really wish we were getting to do that tonight. John actually got to come by and at least sign books on our front porch, and so we got to have a little bit of that feeling, which was really cool. We are grateful to him for that. So just so you know, any book that you order tonight is going to be signed by Jonathan, but we are grateful for the ability to come to you virtually for this really important conversation. So I want to introduce our conversation partners. I also want to invite you to, say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. If you are already familiar with Gideon's Promise and that's why you're here tonight, you can share your stories about Gideon's Promise. I'll be dropping the link in there to the organization in case you want to make donations. We always, want to make sure folks know all nonprofits need support right now. And at the bottom of your screen, you will see a link to buy Gideon's Promise from Charis. You also are going to be able to buy Gilbert's books from Charis tonight. So you got a lot of options. The last thing I want to show you is at the bottom of your screen, there's an Ask a Question button. That's where you can go ahead at any point. It's not disruptive. You can put a question in there. And, if you see a question that's sort of similar to what you already kind of wanted to ask, just upvote the question that you liked. So, that way we'll make sure that we just get the best questions and use our time wisely. So I'm going to introduce our conversation partner first. We're here tonight with Gilbert King. I am sure you recognize his name. He is the author of 3 books, most recently Beneath a Ruthless Sun. His previous book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 2013. You probably saw that book in every bookstore everywhere. It was a huge runaway hit and bestseller, and not only a bestseller, but a truly wonderful book, which is not always, those are not always one and the same. And King's earlier book, The Execution of Willie Francis, was published in 2008. He is currently a fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York. So we're thrilled to have you here, Gilbert.
My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and then we're here tonight to celebrate Jonathan Rapping. He is the founder and president of Gideon's Promise, an organization dedicated to changing the culture and practice of public defense in America. He was awarded a 2014 MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship for his work as a criminal justice innovator. Rapping is a professor at Atlanta's John Marshall Law School and Harvard Law School. He lives in Atlanta, Georgia with his wife and their 2 children, and Gideon's Promise is his first book. So it's always a pleasure to help people launch their very first book baby into the world. So yeah, we're really thrilled to have you both here, and I know it's going to be a great conversation. So I'm going to get out of the way and let y'all take it away.
Thanks, E.R. Well, thanks, E.R. Really appreciate it. I'm really been looking forward to this for a long time. We've been talking about this for a while, and then they had the COVID thing, and book got pushed back a little bit, but here we are, not in person, my great Rebecca, but this is a great crowd, and I can see we're going to have great questions. I'll try to make some of mine as interesting as some of the people who are going to be asking some as well. But Jonathan, I just want to start out by saying, one of the things I'm always in awe when I do a conversation with someone like, you, because I place you in the stratosphere of people like Brian Stevenson and Sister Helen Pragine, and well, frankly, we're all storytellers and who, talk the talk. But, like Brian and like Sister Helen, you also walk the walk. And, as Brian puts it, you are proximate. You're out there on the ground where these battles are being fought. You are fighting for life and death on behalf of your clients, which separates you from just regular writers like me. So I'm hoping you could just talk about a lot of things tonight. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what was it that, made you decide that it's time for you to write this book?
Yeah, well, thank you, Gilbert. Can I start? I just want to say, what a compliment to be named in the same sentence as Sister Helen Pragine and Brian Stevenson. But you should also know, Gilbert, I was a huge fan of yours before we met. So being able to share space with you, Devil in the Grove, really changed my thinking about Thurgood Marshall. So it's an honor to be here. It really is. As far as the question, what made me decide to write the book? I moved to Georgia in 2004 with my wife, who at the time was a school teacher, and my 6-month-old daughter, to be the training director for a statewide public defender system that was starting in Atlanta. 2 years later, Katrina hit, and I went to New Orleans to help with the effort to rebuild that public defender office. Did some work in Alabama, Mississippi, and it was really my introduction to what criminal justice looks like, not only in the Deep South, but increasingly I learned across the country. And I started meeting these young, passionate public defenders who would come to this work because they believed in the work, they believed in the mission, they believed that folks who live on the margins need a voice, and they go into systems that would just beat the spirit out of them. They were systems that just didn't believe poor people deserved to be treated like human beings. And I saw those systems crush these young lawyers. And before you know it, those lawyers would quit, or they would start to become resigned to the status quo. And it really became clear to me that without these lawyers having not just the training and the resources, but the spirit that is needed, people who are thrown into the criminal legal system, who are almost exclusively poor, disproportionately of color, can never have their stories told, right? You talk about storytellers. Public defenders tell the stories of people that otherwise are seen as just case files to be processed. So Illy and I, my wife, started Gideon's Promise to really support those lawyers. We were doing this work for a number of years when all of a sudden the nation started talking about criminal justice reform. And the one piece that was constantly ignored was public defenders. We talked about bail reform. We talked about sentencing reform. We talked about progressive prosecutors and electing better judges, ignored public defenders. And I really wrote this book because I felt like it was critical to have a piece that centers public defenders in this conversation about our ongoing quest for racial and economic justice.
Well, I think that's what I really loved about reading this book. You're a great storyteller, and these storytellers are poignant. And one of the stories you tell early in the book, you talk about taking your son Lucas to the Smithsonian's African American Museum, and then that's followed by a visit to a courtroom. And Lucas makes an observation. I thought that was just really poignant. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Illy and I took Lucas and my daughter Aaliyah. Lucas was 10 at the time, Aaliyah was 14. And we went to DC for a Gideon's Promise fundraiser, and we spent Friday morning at the African American History Museum. And anyone who's been there knows it's this amazing museum that starts in 1619 in the basement, and you start working your way up through history. And we worked our way up to about the 1960s. And then, I mean, you can't do the whole thing in a day. It was about lunchtime. We decided to break for lunch, and my kids wanted to go to the courthouse where I started practicing in DC. So I took the kids to the courthouse. We sat down in a courtroom, and we started watching what are called first appearance hearings or arraignments, where people are brought before the judge for the first time after being arrested the day before. And they bring the young black man and, shackled. They bring him to the judge, and within 20 seconds, they've moved on to the next case. And after about 6 of those, all young black men, Lucas turns to me and says, "Daddy, this is like that museum." And it dawned on me that what was obvious to a 10-year-old child, that what was happening in a courtroom in the nation's capital was more like slavery or Jim Crow than justice. He recognized that, but yet the courtroom was filled with, there was a judge, there were clerks, there were prosecutors, there were defense lawyers, who just every day came into that environment and sort of had become normalized. It was eye-opening for me to hear a 10-year-old child realize something so obvious that all of us have forgotten.
Yeah, that's really something. And obviously started your career really in Washington, D.C., and then you'd go down south and you start ultimately Gideon's Promise. And I'm just wondering what your observations were, like starting in D.C. and the difference between public defense as compared with the South in terms of race and economically disadvantaged.
Yeah, so I started my career in DC, which happens to be one of the few, there are a handful, one of the few public defender systems in the country where people actually get the kind of representation that the Constitution promises. We had manageable caseloads. We had the resources needed to give everyone the sort of the representation they deserve. I mean, I worked 6-7 days a week, often 70 hours a week. But putting in those kinds of hours, I could give people the kind of representation they deserve. When I moved to the South, and let me be clear, this is not a Southern problem. This is true all over the country, but there's certainly a concentration of this in the South. And symbolically, given the South's history with racial oppression, the work in the South takes on, I think, a different meaning for me. But when I came to the South, I think what I realized was it was the first time I really realized that most systems don't care at all about even pretending to live up to our democratic ideals. Look, racially, when I was in DC, I remember as a young law student, first time I walked into a courtroom in DC, and at the time, DC was probably 50% black, 50% white, roughly. You wouldn't know there were white people who committed crimes in DC. Everybody who was being charged was black. So I don't mean to suggest that in these systems where public defender systems are relatively well-resourced, there aren't racial and economic disparities. But there was a respect for the ability to give people a voice that didn't exist in Georgia or in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi or now any of the 26 states we work in Gideon's Promise.
Yeah, and you write a lot in the book about the culture of criminal justice, and it's particularly the role of the prosecutor. And one of the quotes that really jumped out at me, which was, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," and how difficult those cultures are to overcome. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think as I started watching, as I said, about 5 years ago or so, the nation started this bipartisan conversation about criminal justice reform. And what I started noticing was that all of the fixes proposed were these legislative fixes, right? If we could just end money bonds, if we could do away with mandatory minimums, right? We could shrink the prison system. We could start to chip away at mass incarceration. And while all of that is true, what was clear to me that those things were symptoms of a greater problem. The problem was cultural. The criminal justice system is shaped by a culture that really thinks some lives don't matter, that some lives are inhuman. And if all we do is we reduce the number of people coming in on the front end and we cut the amount of time they spend in prison on the back end, we can shrink the system, but it will still be a system that hates poor people, that hates people of color, that is reserved exclusively for people of color and poor people. And if we don't change a culture so that we actually see other people's children as valuable as our own, all we can do is have less injustice. We'll never really have justice. So we're building a movement of public defenders really to transform the values that have shaped a system that is decimating communities based on income, based on race.
And that was another thing that really jumped out at me reading your book was you talked about, the culture of the prosecution and how they sometimes look at constitutional safeguards as seen as like pesky rules or irritating technicalities. Can you talk about that? And how does that happen within a prosecutor's office?
Well, so I mean, any public defender can tell you, they've all experienced this where they go into a courtroom and there are far more cases on the docket that can ever possibly be handled consistent with sort of what justice demands. And so prosecutors have been given these tools that allow them to move large volumes of cases quickly. They can ask that people be held on money bonds simply because they're poor, and then use the promise of getting out of jail to coerce someone into taking a plea. They can overcharge them with crimes that carry incredible amounts of time, and then give them a deal to reduce the pain to a manageable level, and people can't resist that. And so prosecutors have been able to, they've prioritized moving cases using these tools, overcharging, pretrial detention, to coerce people into pleading guilty. We no longer have a system where people actually get the rights that we imagine. No, there are no more trials. There are no more juries. Only less than 95% or more than 95% of the cases brought into the system result in pleas. And that's because prosecutors have found ways to get around those constitutional protections that we revere in theory, but that really don't exist.
And that was another really interesting thing I thought you mentioned. I never really thought about this, but you talk about, well, every defendant has their day in court. But you argue there's not a day in court for most of the defendants you're dealing with.
Maybe 3 minutes. Right? Maybe 3 minutes. I mean, I can't tell. So many people show up in court on day one and feeling like they have no hope in the world. They plead guilty that day. They don't even know their lawyer's name yet. The lawyer hasn't done any investigation. They haven't had time to file any motion. And to be clear, so Illy's story, Illy is not a lawyer. She comes from Buffalo, New York, and her introduction to the criminal legal system was when her father went to prison when she was 5. And he went to prison with a public defender. And he was charged with crimes he had committed years earlier. By the time he was arrested, he turned his life around. He was a small business owner, married, converted to Islam, had 3 children. His mother was pregnant with a 4th. Illy was the oldest at 5. He had a public defender that never told that story. And he was sentenced to Attica for 10 years, and she grew up knowing her father from behind bars. And what Illy always says, which is kind of at the heart of what we do at Gideon's Promise, is, you know, what was even harder than growing up with a father behind bars was coming to realize the people that are in my life, the men I know, don't matter. And primarily that message is delivered by a public defender, not one who he wasn't a bad person, but probably overwhelmed and learned to process human beings.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And a lot of the things that you write about seem so obvious, but just reading them for the first time, really eye-opening. And one of the things I think, you know, you are a storyteller, and that's really what a public defender is. And you write about this instance where the narration of a case is often based on what you call the universe of facts provided by the prosecution. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, you know, look, the prosecutor gets facts that the police give them. The police create a narrative based on what the police have learned. They only include the worst facts, and they always paint a portrait of guilt. And that's where we start out on day one. And if that's all you know, the case looks really bad. If there is a whole universe of facts out there that with a competent, well-trained lawyer, through investigation, through interviewing, through motions practice, through pretrial hearings, you can learn so much more about the case, but lawyers don't have time. And that's why, Gilbert, we are seeing wrongful convictions, people who spend 10, 20, 30 years in prison. They went to prison with everyone believing one thing, and then all of a sudden, 30 years later, we've learned something that the lawyers never had the time to uncover on the front end.
Yeah, that really resonates with me at this particular time, which we can talk about another time. But one of the things that you write about too is, you know, prosecutors who cut corners are rarely chastised. And can you talk about some of the corners that are cut within a case by the prosecutor that maybe don't rise to prosecutorial misconduct like Brady violations, but they're still important? And what are those subtle things that a prosecutor can do that can sort of, you know, cut those corners that you're talking about that just makes life difficult for everybody?
Yeah, so I teach law school, and I teach students, some of whom will become future prosecutors. And what I always say to them is, you know, unfortunately, over 50 years of living in a tough on crime America, prosecutors are taught that the goal is to win convictions, right? Winning becomes paramount. And when winning is paramount, doing things like revealing evidence of innocence, which is constitutionally required, that becomes information you give a savvy defense lawyer to get a guilty person off. So you find a way to maybe bury it, right? Maybe if you learn that the police officer engaged in a Fourth Amendment violation, an illegal search, right? And shining a light on that is going to lose a piece of evidence that might hurt your chances to win. You sort of bury that. And prosecutors have learned to bury that, and they don't get challenged. They get away with it. And look, Gilbert, I also want to say, Devil in the Grove, as I said, it really changed the way I think about Thurgood Marshall, who I knew as a judge I loved, but you introduced me to someone who was really a public defender, right? He was doing this work in the case of the Groveland boys, 1949, the early 50s, when prosecutors were cutting corners all the time. And he went up against great odds, right? No one loved him. No one was applauding him back then. and he fought because he believed in it. And I really think that the lawyers we're training, the public defenders out there, they are, Thurgood Marshall is their ancestor. They are the descendants of Thurgood Marshall, right? Thurgood Marshall was a hero, but these lawyers are heroes too. They are taking on prosecutors who are cutting corners left and right, and it's about race and it's about class, just like it was in 1949.
Yeah, and then that's an interesting thing that made me think, like, as a writer, I write a book about the Groveland boys, and let's just say I had come across some, confession. I write a book about, and I decide, well, that doesn't really help my narrative. I'm going to hide this stuff and not. I'm going to write my book as if I never saw that. And someone discovered that. I think my book might be pulled from the shelves. I would probably suffer career consequences for doing that. And yet prosecutors do that all the time, where people's lives are at stake, and they really get like a slap on the wrist at most. How is that even possible?
But again, Gilbert, I want to go back to this issue of culture, because I think it's easy to say these are evil people, and if we just get good prosecutors in there, it will be different. I don't believe they're evil people. I mean, sure, there are some bad people in every profession, but for the most part, these are law students that go into a system that teach them, right, subtly, but over time they learn that winning is the name of the game, that these are bad people, right? We use language that is dehumanizing. We call people monsters and villains. They're defendants. They're never called by their name. And after a while, your goal is to protect us from them, and the ends justify the means. That's how it happens. It's culture, the same culture that's shaping defense lawyers to sort of go along with processing, shapes prosecutors to cut corners, and shapes judges to sit on the bench and watch it happen.
Right. And that was another thing I was really struck by in your book. Like, just you're going back constantly to the idea of dignity, and how that you didn't want public defenders having a whiteboard where we talk about, the dumbest criminal that we encountered, and how that needed to be removed from these offices. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more, about the restoring dignity to this profession.
Yeah, so I think, at the heart of what we teach at Gideon's Promise, and what the sort of amazing public defenders I spend my time with understand, is that really we serve other human beings. And our job is to learn their stories, to understand the humanity of the people we serve, and to amplify those voices and shine that humanity into the system. And I think that far too often, defense lawyers are trained that being a defense lawyer is about a set of technical skills, where if you could do the best cross-examination, you win, or you come up with the best theory of defense, you win. And it's not that that's not important, but if that's done without making sure we are giving dignity and respect and amplifying the humanity of the people we serve, it remains a cold, callous system where it's two lawyers battling it out their own egos. It's not about human beings that we serve.
That's interesting. One of the other parts of the book that was really, really fascinating to me was you talk about the training program that you designed, and one of your faculty members, Jeff Schur, is teaching public defenders that there are 3 types of overarching motivators that you worked into your curriculum. Can you talk about those motivators and the different types and how they play out in the public defender practice? Yeah.
I'm glad you gave Jeff a shout out. He's one of the many amazing faculty members who volunteer their time to work with us. But yeah, Jeff sort of came up with this model, and he would say, he would want me to mention that it's based on the work of people like Charles Ogletree and Abby Smith and others. But the idea is this: we teach a model of representation that we call client-centered representation. It's about the client. The client is centered. They are what matters. And what Jeff teaches is that client-centered lawyers come to this work primarily for one of 3 reasons. Some because they have the social worker motivator. They do this work because they want to help people. Some because they don't like bullies. They want to fight a government that has all the power, and they want to stand up for the little guy. And some because they believe that what's happening in our criminal legal system is about racial justice and economic justice. It's a civil rights issue, and they want to be part of a community that is committed to building a better world for our children. So he would call the first group social workers, the second group the second group would be warriors, and the third group movement builders. And the triangle says all of us may have one primary motivator, but we're all motivated to some degree by all three. And no one motivator can get us through every time. I might be the social worker who does this work because I love the human beings I serve, but I'll get that case where there's a client I just can't connect with. I just don't feel like, we're on the same page, and that social worker motivator isn't keeping me up till midnight to file motion. So I tap into my warrior motivator and say, I might not be feeling this client in this moment, but you know what? I sure want to stand up for them when the government is coming with all their might to steamroll them. And so if we learn to move around that triangle and tap into different motivators, we can more easily sustain ourselves and avoid, the sort of emotional trauma that drives us from the work. So when we train our lawyers, we often will use real world challenges and ask them to think about how they're going to come at them through different lenses to really exercise all those motivators.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. And you would say that the key to longevity is being able to tap into that triangle and not just be one of those motivators.
Yeah, it's finding a way. Look, we also start our training program with people sharing why they come to this work. And people come to this work for all kinds of reasons, but they're all powerful. And the question is, how do you make sure 10 years from now, you haven't lost the passion, you haven't lost the motivation that brought you to the work when the system's trying to beat it out of you? That model is one tool we use to help lawyers maintain their motivation.
Yeah, and then again, I'm really just drawn to some of the way you tell these stories and the way you present what you want to write about in sort of using modern examples and analogies. And one of the ones, one of your faculty members, Sean Mayer, he tells students about the movie The Matrix and how public defenders can choose between the blue pill and the red pill. And I thought that was just fascinating to read. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so we start off, we have a 3-year program for new lawyers. We got 5 programs, but our core program is for new lawyers. It's a 3-year program, and it starts with sort of a 2-week, it's a very intensive, almost like a boot camp, where the class comes together and we do everything together for 14 days. And at the end, we come together and just share parting thoughts. And Sean tells a story, and he talks about the Matrix, which is the story of Morpheus and Neo, and the Morpheus says to Neo, I've got 2 pills. I've got a red pill and a blue pill. And if you take the blue pill, you will always, everything will seem great, right? Food will taste better. Your life will be richer. You'll never know pain. But if you take the red pill, you'll enter the matrix. You'll know pain. You'll know suffering, but you'll know reality. That's life. And Sean tells them, you all just took the red pill, right? You've decided to enter a profession where you're going to know pain, where you're going to be up close to injustice. But if you don't do that, you won't know reality. You won't have the satisfaction of being a part of making the world better. Many lawyers take the blue pill. They work in high-rise buildings. They live in gated communities. They literally have set themselves up so they don't even realize some of these problems exist. Public defenders are the opposite. They run to the people that need the help the most. And that comes with pain. So you need strategies to motivate yourself. You need a community to support you. You need colleagues who love you and remind you every day that you're not crazy for not going along with a system that's so unjust.
Wow. Going back to the criminal justice system, one of the things you also write about is how the justice system is judge-centered rather than justice-centered, that mindset. Can you talk a little bit about the judge's role and how many view public defenders and defendants within that system?
Yeah, so in many places, right, the way the system is structured is so that the judge has a lot of power over public defenders. In some places, judges are among those who get to help appoint the public defender. In some places where they don't have public defender offices, judges actually appoint the lawyers. And you can imagine these perverse incentives where pleasing the judge is necessary to ensure you keep getting work. And so you have systems where rather than fighting for clients, lawyers feel conflicted and often learn to satisfy judges. And to be a public defender, right? Your job is not to make a judge's life easy. Judges often want cases to move quickly. But what we understand is that justice requires that we take time to look behind the allegations. That is time consuming. Justice isn't quick. And so that tension, if you are a judge-centered lawyer and your incentive is to please the judge so you can keep working or you can keep your position, you can't serve your clients and continue to keep the judge happy.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. I guess I want to bring it more towards the current day and talk about this year with this year of 2020, which has seen so much. Following the killing of George Floyd, you're starting to see more of a public demand for, criminal justice reform, defunding the police. And obviously that phrase gets batted around in political circles. But what would that look like, defunding the police, I think, from your perspective, in an ideal form?
Yeah, and I would even say defunding the police. I take it further and say defunding the criminal legal system, right? Because I think it's important to remember that right now these highly publicized killings, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, they have us all as a nation aware of our nation's history of racial oppression. But for every person killed by a police officer, tens of thousands survive those police encounters and are thrown into a criminal legal system where they're subjected to a violence as well. It's an invisible violence. It's a violence that isn't captured by cell phones. It's a violence when you are thrown in a cage, processed through a system, your voice isn't heard. So that routine violence that happens every day is connected to the violence we see on the streets. And I think defunding the police or defunding the criminal legal system, right, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have any police. What it means is instead of funding police and our criminal legal system to literally deal with every problem that poor communities face, right? The one way we address every problem faced by low-income communities, whether it's houselessness, whether it's illiteracy, whether it is substance abuse or mental illness, we criminalize it and we deal with it in the criminal legal system. Defund the police, defund the criminal legal system means let's invest in services outside of the criminal legal system to treat health issues as health issues, to treat people the way we would treat our children when they're in trouble, and reserve the system of policing and punishment for only those really extreme cases where it's truly necessary. What it really means is let's treat other people's children like we would want to treat our own. And the last thing I want to say, Gilbert, is I've heard this said, and I think it's such a great way to put it, is we already know what defunding the police looks like. Go to the suburbs. Go to wealthy communities. Go to relatively predominantly white communities. You don't see police cars driving around. When someone has a substance abuse problem, they go to the hospital. Let's do that for everybody's children. That's what it is.
Now, that was a really great way of putting it. I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing that because we hear the most inflammatory descriptions of what that would look like. And that was just really reality based as far as I'm concerned. One of the things I talk, because I write mostly about history. So my current events are a little bit not nearly where you are. And I remember I had a conversation with Brian Stevenson, a couple of years ago, and I was describing him some of the things that I'd seen in the 40s and 50s and court appointed attorneys who basically didn't want to, give a strident defense on their client because they didn't want to rattle the criminal justice system. These were the people they were hoped to work for. Maybe they were an oil attorney or a real estate attorney, and they're taking this criminal case as a favor to the criminal justice system, but they didn't want to ruin any of their relationships. So they didn't really do much. They were described as like two lampposts. They didn't cross-examine witnesses, and they didn't really put on their own defense. And I remember Brian just looked at me like incredulous, like, that still happens. Does that still happen?
Yeah, well, if Brian says it does, it does. No, I mean, absolutely. Look, what happens in criminal legal systems varies not just from state to state, but from county to county. But in most parts of America, absolutely. I mean, when people say negative things about public defenders, Again, I love public defenders, and I believe really courageous people come to this work. But I also recognize that there are many places where those systems do not let you survive if you are a zealous, aggressive, hard-charging public defender. And if you don't have support, and you don't have a community, and you don't have an office, you can't survive in those places. So absolutely, in so many places, I mean, we've got a presence in a handful of counties in Georgia, a few counties in Louisiana, a couple of counties in Alabama. The rest of those places, right, frequently are exactly what Brian's talking about, exactly what you're talking about. It's people who are processing human beings quickly.
Right, and that was another thing I remember reading about this just a few years ago and looking into Alabama, the state of Alabama, and then how they didn't really have a capital defense program to defend people who were having, the death row and their appeals. And I think it was the attorney general at the time, this was several years ago, he says, we don't need that program. We got these fancy New York firms that come down and represent these clients when they're facing the death penalty. We don't need to fund that kind of a program in our state. Is that something you see remnants of that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the reason why these fancy New York law firms, which is really just another way of saying lawyers who happen to have the resources needed to do the job, the reason they come in, they almost always come in well after the injustice has been put in place. They're almost always undoing some incredible harm after an individual who has not had the representation we promise in our Constitution, after they haven't had that. And those tend to be the cases where there is an issue that is most obvious. So for every case where some fancy New York law firm comes down, there are so many cases where we desperately need people to have that kind of lawyer to give them the representation that they deserve. You may have followed just a couple of weeks ago, a week ago, Curtis Flowers eventually, right, was released after the state of Mississippi decided not to try him for a 7th time, but he had to go through 7 trials where the prosecutor repeatedly engaged in unconstitutional behavior, consciously getting rid of black jurors. And after 6 convictions, and all of them being overturned or mistrials, they finally, because lawyers from the outside who had resources came down and did the investigation. And I want to give credit to the heroic public defenders who fought every day and made the record. But it took those kind of resources to finally free Curtis Flowers after 25 years.
Right. And what are your thoughts about that? Because that really comes down to the appellate system, but the appellate system is not the appellate and the appeals are not always successful. And a lot of times you're on the ground floor. If you lose this case, it may never be seen by a higher court. And so then really it shows the importance of the public defender's office and that really on the ground, kind of like Thurgood Marshall, being there on the ground in the courtroom. That's maybe your best chance because you're presumed innocent at that point. When you get to the appellate system later, you're presumed guilty.
That's so right. It is so hard to undo the damage post-conviction, which is why when it happens, we hear about it. It doesn't happen that often. If we would invest in public defenders on the front end, we could avoid so much of this injustice, and we wouldn't need these law firms coming down and doing the work because the public defenders would have the resources they need to do the work right on the front end.
Well, we've got some really good questions lined up here from the audience, and I'm going to start with some of them right here. This is a question. This was no name, but what are your thoughts about the military justice model? What I'm thinking about is a model where there are justice advocates. In other words, the lawyers can be assigned to both prosecute or defend. The advocates are assigned to perform either role.
Yeah. So I will say I'm not an expert in the military justice model. I do know that they do not have the resource issues that we tend to see in state systems that we're talking about. For me, I think, and I have to say, my view of our criminal legal system, I really do embrace the sort of the message of Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow, that our criminal legal system today is really just a manifestation of the same underlying narrative and culture that drove slavery to black codes to Jim Crow. Mass incarceration is the latest sort of version of that. And if you believe that, as I do, I think, and our lawyers tend to feel this way, they wouldn't want to go from defense to prosecution. The reason they do this work is they want to help get people out from under a racist, classist system. They have no interest in then switching sides and trying their hand at locking up poor black people. And I think that's not a perfect analogy to the military system. So I don't mean to say that to bash the military system. I think it doesn't work where we are because the systems are quite different.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I have a question from Jim Wool, who says, it almost sounds as though the culture teaches cynicism, both among government actors and public defenders. Is that fair? If so, has this been a progressive evolution of the culture? Have there been pivotal events, legislation, for example, that changed what at one time was a less cynical culture in the criminal justice system? Or is the system flawed from the start?
Well, I certainly think the system is flawed from the start. I mean, look, the founding fathers developed a system with protections that really are quite remarkable, but they were never meant to apply to the people who are in the criminal justice system today. They were never designed to apply to poor black folks. When the founding fathers drafted the Constitution, it didn't apply to black people. Black people weren't dealt with through the criminal justice system at the time. And so I think now that we've come to a point where our criminal legal system really is dealing with people that used to be sort of otherized through slavery or through legal means of segregation. Now that we've done that, I think that we see an abandonment of those ideals, and I do think the culture in the country hasn't changed. I think it had shifted from a system of slavery to a system of mass incarceration, or to a system of Jim Crow, to a system of mass incarceration. So I don't know that there's a pivotal event. I think we've always been driven by this narrative. It's just now playing out in the criminal justice system, whereas it used to play out in other systems.
This question is from Claire. It says, Gilbert's books often deal with overt physical violence exacted against black bodies, while the violence against black bodies today is more subtle, but still exists. Is there a way to convince the players in the criminal punishment bureaucracy that what our system does is analogous to the lynching days of yore?
Well, so let me say, I'm reluctant to draw the comparison of lynching, because I think that's an atrocity that deserves to be talked about on its own. But I absolutely think that the violence that we do to black and brown bodies in the system today should be seen as very similar to violence that we've always done to black and brown bodies. I mean, there is absolutely physical violence. I mean, if you're not talking about the killings like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, you've got Jacob Blake, who was shot in the back 7 times unarmed and then handcuffed to a gurney. When you look at people who are thrown into jails and prisons, right, oftentimes they are physically abused. You can you can watch the documentary about Khalif Browder and the hell he endured in Rikers Island. So I absolutely think the physical abuse, and certainly when you're talking about the death penalty, right, it is a form of modern day execution that is completely race and class based. But I think that the violence we do to people, the violence we do to children like Illy when she's 5 years old, having to think that the people she loves don't matter and growing up to question her own self-worth, I wouldn't minimize that violence, the violence we do to communities when they come to understand there is an entire system designed to otherize them and to crush them.
Yeah, and I think you write about Michael Brown, and one of the things I think I was struck about, like, it's not overt violence, physical violence, but it's sort of administrative violence. You see that, there's this revenue stream that can be gained by just, issuing summons, and then people don't have the money to pay, and they become part of the system. They have to stay in prison. Their fines increase, and there was a report that was done by, I think it was the criminal justice or the DOJ, that just pointed out instance after instance of just this form of harassment that was leading to revenue for these counties. Right. Is that something you see throughout the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So in most places, if you're put on probation or parole or supervised release, right, that's a for-profit industry. And so, you have to pay fines, you have to pay fees for services. And as soon as you can't make that payment, you're often thrown back in jail. There's also, in addition to that, abuse that happens even beyond incarceration. There's losing the right to vote. There's losing the right to still live in subsidized housing, which might mean that you and your family are rendered homeless. There's losing the ability to work certain jobs, right? There's losing the ability to get educational loans and other benefits that communities, that so many people need to survive. So absolutely, I mean, that violence comes in so many forms.
One of the things that it gets brought up every once in a while is this idea of, and you write about this a lot in Gideon's Promise, the plea deals and what that means to a criminal justice system. And I've heard people talk about this. All it would take is if everybody got together, every defendant, and said no more pleas, that it would absolutely paralyze the criminal justice system. Is that something that's practical, or is that expecting certain martyrs to go out there and say, I will go to jail before I take a plea, and I'm doing it for the system? And is that something that could ever happen?
Well, so let me say this. It's funny you bring that up, because we had a conversation several years ago. Michelle Alexander actually wrote an article in the New York Times called "Go to Trial, Crash the System." And she was basically saying if everyone demanded a trial, literally the system would crash. And we had our gathering of public defenders, of Gideon's Promise. A new class came in, and we had a community activist who was visiting with us. And she brought up that article and said, look, why don't you all just refuse pleas and go to trial? And it really started this interesting conversation, because, again, we're training our lawyers to be client-centered. And while the movement builder in us might really love the idea of crashing the system, we represent an individual. And if that individual says to me, hey, rapping, I love that idea about crashing the system. That's really cool. But you know what I really want to do? I'd love to get home Friday evening so I can see my daughter's soccer game. Do you think you can get me home? Well, I have to have a conversation about how that can happen. And so ultimately, as much as that the activist in me might want to crash the system, the public defender in me has a primary obligation to that individual. Now, I do think community organizers can mobilize community to insist on trials. And if people insist on that, public defenders have to respect that. But it can't be driven by public defenders. Our preference can't overtake the preference of the people we serve.
Yeah, and I want to actually run another thing by you, because I find it's just absolutely fascinating listening to you. It brings up so many more questions. But this might please you, actually. I'm working on a case that takes place in the 1980s. And this one man who's wrongfully convicted, he's arrested and goes into jail, and he has conversations with other inmates who basically tell him, he's a young kid, you cannot go with a public pretender. Your life is on the line. You're facing the death penalty. And so he because he had an insurance settlement coming from an automobile accident, he used that money to get a fancy private attorney. And he says it was the biggest mistake of his life, because the people in that public defender's office were experienced. They were, they were older. They'd been around, and they fought really aggressively. And he believes he would have been much, much better off in his case if he would have stuck with the public defenders rather than go off and find a private attorney. Is that something also, like the experience and the knowing the names and the prosecutors and the judges, that you are better off with a public defender a lot of times?
So let me say this: the good public defender offices in this country, those are the best criminal defense lawyers you're going to find. And it's not just because they know the judges and they know the prosecutors. They have the passion. I'm sorry, did I lose you? Do we have you, Gilbert?
I can still hear you,
I don't know.
John.
Okay, I'll continue while Gilbert gets that fixed.
Go right ahead.
Thanks. So I think you're right. The best lawyers in the country are public defenders. It's also true that for every good public defender office, there certainly are those that are not very good. And I think that sometimes people in jails who are telling friends in jail, you don't want the public defender, is because they had a bad experience. And so what we certainly teach our public defenders is, it's human nature when someone comes to you and says, I don't want you, you suck, you're a public pretender, to sort of want to get your back against the wall and say, fine, then go somewhere else. What we teach is that, look, we have to understand there's a reason why the people we serve feel that way. It's not personal. Our job is now to help them understand that we are going to fight for them. And that means we can't just tell them we have to earn it. So there's a process of relationship building and trust building that has to precede the work that high-paid private lawyers, where they begin, right? And so I think every public defender has faced that, which is why we believe that a critical piece of being a good public defender is learning how to take time and develop that relationship and overcome those hurdles before you can really jump into the work of defending a person.
I have a question from Sharon Williams. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's from Sharon Williams. She says, is there a role for communities in supporting the culture change you speak of and in supporting public defenders?
So if this is the Sharon Williams is an amazing leader of Gideon's Promise. Although it's a common name, but I'm assuming this is the Sharon Williams, my dear friend Sharon Williams. So let me say this, absolutely. And I think a huge part of the work we do at Gideon's Promise is teaching public defenders that we have to be allies to community. We have to work with community. And in the book, I talk about a dear friend of Gideon's Promise, a man named Raj Jayadev, who is the founder of an organization called Silicon Valley Debug. And they developed a model called Participatory Defense. And it really is a model. And Raj is a community organizer, not a lawyer. But this model of participatory defense is a model that teaches community organizations to see public defenders as allies and partners, and to see public defenders, to have public defenders see those communities as important allies as well, and how they can work together. And so absolutely, I think it's a mistake for public defenders to think, I'm the lawyer, I know everything. You, the community, quit calling me, let me save your loved one and leave me alone. That's a mistake, and it's not what the community needs from its public defenders.
A lot of the people that you write about, I just feel like they've just been so influential and so important in the role of criminal justice. And one of the people I wanted to mention was somebody who's very connected to Atlanta, Stephen Bright, and Southern Poverty Law Center, Yale University, death penalty extraordinaire. Can you talk about Stephen Bright and your relationship with him and maybe what you've gained and learned from him?
What haven't I gained and learned from Stephen Bright? Stephen Bright, we could do a whole session on him. I mean, he's a hero of mine. Stephen Bright was a public defender in DC years before I got there, but he always remained connected to the organization. So as a young public defender, I started to learn from Steve about his stories of his work in the South. And ultimately, when Georgia started a new statewide public defender, it was Steve that invited me, asked me to come down, encouraged me, convinced me, and Illy to come down and move to Georgia and do this work. And Steve was a mentor and a supporter of mine and has been ever since. The other thing I have to say about the Southern Center for Human Rights, which is a wonderful organization here in Atlanta doing incredible criminal justice reform work. We were birthed by the Southern Center for Human Rights. When we started, we had a small grant from the Soros Foundation, and Southern Center for Human Rights was our host organization. And we spent a few years jumping between, Illy and I would jump between an office at FCHR and our living room, building this thing before we actually became our own 501c3 nonprofit. But Stephen Bright is there'd be no Gideon's Promise if it weren't for Stephen Bright, and there would be far fewer courageous public defenders and social justice warriors in the places where they're needed most if it weren't for Stephen Bright.
Yeah, and I should say thank you for correcting me, because I said Southern Poverty Law Center and I meant Southern Center for Human Rights, and there is a big difference there. So thank you for correcting that. One of the things I also wanted to ask you about was just Gideon's Promise in general. What would you describe as your greatest accomplishment and contribution to the criminal justice system with this organization? And what's like the most important goal that's hanging out there for you that you feel is, obtainable and within reach?
Yeah, I really think our greatest accomplishment, the thing that I'm most proud of is, look, we started with 16 lawyers from 2 offices in New Orleans and Atlanta. And today we have over 1,000 public defenders from coast to coast who are part of this community. And what I realized when I moved to Georgia and started doing work in the South, it's not that there weren't lawyers who thought about this work the way the public defenders I knew in DC did. There was no concentrated community where being a client-centered lawyer connected to community was sort of valued. That there wasn't a big community around that. I think my proudest accomplishment is that we have taken some really amazing people who were amazing before they met Gideon's Promise, amazing in their own right, but we've given them a home to come to so they can commune and convene and support each other. We are now I think a haven for public defenders who want to do this work as client-centered social justice advocates. It's a shelter they can come to when the system's trying to beat that spirit out of them. That's probably what I'm most proud of.
And what do you think is hanging out there as something that's reachable for you? Like maybe in the current climate, that there's something of a goal that you could look at and say, we can do this.
Well, I'll say a couple things. I mean, one thing is, one of the things that I think has held us back the most is we don't really have a home. We've grown into a large community. It's hard to find a place. We bring our lawyers together every 6 months because that live human contact is critical. And we went from small, 4-H camps to small hotels to now we've got to go to huge conference centers. And so one goal is before I retire, I'd love for us to build a public defender training and culture change center. So public defenders have a home where they can come to. That's one thing that I think is achievable. And we're in the midst of a capital campaign to do this. The other thing that I really think is an achievable goal is, as I said, we have several dozen offices in our network. I would like to see every public defender office in the country go through this model of training, be connected to this community in this way, and to continue to reach places where there are not formal public defender offices, where we can work with court-appointed lawyers who are on their own and bring them into the community. And we have a model to do that.
That's really interesting. And if anybody else has a question out there, feel free to add one. I have another question. Going out and speaking about the cases I write about, sometimes I'm surprised, but I shouldn't really be surprised. You obviously get public defenders and people who want to be inspired by the work of social justice and make a difference. But I'm always surprised that I get young prosecutors coming in and saying, I care about this stuff too, and I'm making a choice to be a prosecutor, but I know that I can do the right thing and seek justice instead of convictions. Do you run into people like that when you speak?
Sure. I think now, right? I mean, I think the last couple of years, the concept of progressive prosecutor or reform-minded prosecutor has really caught on. I have to say, I applaud prosecutors that want to do this work more humanely, less cruelly. I think it's important to bring thoughtful, justice-minded prosecutors into this work. I think where I part company is sometimes in the progressive prosecutor movement, there is a sense that progressive prosecutors are to lead the charge to transform criminal justice, that they are the saviors. And I think prosecutors have been told for so long that they're the most powerful players in the system, that they believe they are the only ones necessary to do this change. And what I always say is a progressive prosecutor can't act on their most progressive instincts without a public defender, because if they don't know the human being standing next to them, they can only act on stereotypes. One thing Brian Stevenson says, and you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, is that proximity, that you can't do justice without getting proximate to the people who your decisions impact. And literally in our criminal legal system, public defenders are the vehicle through which judges, prosecutors, everyone else gets proximate to the human beings impacted by their decisions. So I would say progressive prosecutors, reform-minded judges, they can't act on their best instincts if they don't support public defenders.
You know, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is your experiences with these conviction integrity review units that you're seeing more and more of, and they're within the prosecutor's office. But I think getting back to storytelling, it seems like they're able to maybe not just rely on DNA evidence. They can go back and look at the narrative again and really see if their own offices have gotten this case right. And they are doing cases that are being overturned by some fantastic conviction integrity review units that I've spoken to down in Florida. I'm just curious what your experiences with them is.
Well, look, who can't be in favor of conviction integrity review units or any effort to undo wrongful convictions? I think what I would say is this. I think that we have far too narrow an idea of what a wrongful conviction is, right? We somehow think wrongful convictions is limited to someone who is completely innocent. And those are the only people worth investing in. And in fact, I define wrongful convictions as anybody who was unjustly over-prosecuted, over-punished, right, over-incarcerated. We have so many wrongful convictions. We ought to be undoing convictions, even where people may be factually guilty, but they've been punished far beyond what they should be punished for. And I have to say, my friend Sam Starks and I just wrote a piece in Creative Loafing, which is a local magazine in Atlanta, about one such wrongful conviction. There was a case here that listeners probably know of, the Atlanta Public School cheating scandal, where prosecutors wanted to go after some educators who cheated in Atlanta public schools, and they cast a net so broad, they used a RICO theory of prosecution that was designed for mafia and organized crime, and they literally pulled in many prosecutors, some guilty, some innocent, and there are many educators, some guilty, some innocent, and there are 9 educators right now pending prison sentences out on appeal. 2 have already done prison sentences. I know some of these educators. They are mothers and fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, never in trouble a day in their life until they get caught up in this RICO net years later. If you met them, you would say, how could anyone want them in a cage? Those are wrongful convictions too, and we need to be committed to undoing those just as much as we are the actual innocence cases.
That was really interesting. Again, I just want to say, I think Gideon's Promise is such a rich book. There's so many great stories, and I think that's one of the things I really love about the book is you're able to focus on the humanity of these stories, and then you learn something about the law, and you come away thinking, this doesn't seem right. I'm glad there's an organization like this that is fighting this. But I guess if there's anything that you wanted to leave, your audience with, any message that maybe we haven't talked about tonight, is there anything you'd want to say to the people listening?
There's a story I often tell. It's not in the book, so I'll share it, and you won't get it anywhere else. But unless you hear me talk, because I do say it sometimes. But I often say that really everything I know about consequences, I think I learned as a parent. I don't even call it punishment. I call it consequences. And my wife and I, we have rules in our house. And we expect our children to abide by the rules. And if our children don't follow the rules, there are consequences. And we fashion consequences that are always designed to help our children continue to succeed in life to grow, to become better human beings. We never fashion consequences designed to cripple or destroy or crush our children. And I believe in the criminal legal system that we have a responsibility to treat other people's children when they make mistakes the way we would want to treat our own children. And you can walk into any courtroom in America and you can watch things happening to other people's children that you would never tolerate for your own. And if that's the case, we have a lot of work to do. So I just hope people will join us, learn more about Gideon's Promise. Obviously, check out the book, check out the organization, and reach out to us. We'd love to figure out ways to partner with you in this effort to address what I think is the most pressing civil rights issue that we're facing today. I also want to end by saying, Gilbert, I'm such a fan. I mean, man, this has been such an honor for me. I can't be more thrilled that I got to spend this hour.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I honestly you write so passionately, and I've read this book twice now. I really put it in there with Just Mercy and Dead Man Walking, Brian Stevenson and Sister Helen. I just think it's that kind of book that's not just your personal journey and through this, but you're just such a terrific writer and so engaging. And I just can't urge people enough to go out and really read this book. So, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I wish it was not over the screen, but this has been a really delightful conversation as far as I'm concerned. And I hope to meet you in person one of these days.
Man, Gilbert, you telling me I'm a great writer, you've made my day. My wife, Illy, as soon as I leave this room and go upstairs, she's going to have to figure a way to bring my head back down. Thank you.
Nonsense. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This was a really exciting and wonderful conversation. As Gilbert said, the book rewards continued engagement. So I hope folks will get it. I know I'm going to buy it for some lawyers in my life on both sides of the fence. And I think, a lot of folks will really learn a lot. So I'm thrilled that this is out there. I think it's actually a very practical, hands-on tool as well. So not too esoteric. And I think it's a good conversation starter for folks who, maybe have heard defund the police and then they're like, well, what does that mean? And then where do we go from there? This is another aspect of that conversation. I think it's really useful to be able to be educated when we're having these conversations with people and to really dream, bigger dreams about how we can have a more human and livable world for all people. And as you said, for creating a world for everyone's children that looks like the future we want for our own children. So that's what we are fighting for at Charis. And so that's why this book was so aligned with our mission. And that's why what Gideon's Promise does really just speaks to us so much. So be sure to click this teal button at the bottom. Go home. You can purchase multiple copies. You also, of course, can pick up Gilbert's books, which are amazing. If you've not read any of his books, they really do form sort of a historical background to a lot of these conversations in many, many ways. So that they're a perfect complement. And the last thing, it's my honor to remind you that all of the work that we do at Charis is also nonprofit work. And, part of what we do is cultivate these conversations because we do believe that books change lives and help people get free. So, we whatever economic state you're in right now, we know a lot of people are having a hard time, but $1 or $5 really helps us out to be able to, pay for this platform and do this work. So we really appreciate you. And want to let folks know we'll be repackaging this with captions and putting it on YouTube. So if there are people who are deaf or hard of hearing in your world that you think would really like this, just let them know it's going to be up on YouTube soon, and that will have captions so that they can read it and follow along. So I think that's it. Thank you both so much. Thanks to everyone in the chat who asked really thoughtful questions. Y'all were a great audience. And I hope that y'all will come check out all of Charis's events. If this is your first time, we do events almost every night of the week. So there's always something. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We love Charis. Y'all have been just wonderful.
Thank you. It's been really great to know everybody in your organization. It's been really fun. So thanks to Illy and Brandon and everyone. Yep. All right. Y'all have a good night and stay safe.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now. Take care.